Daniel Okafor was working late on his third night as the new CEO of Halbrook Financial Group, alone on the executive floor at 11:40 p.m. when he heard movement behind the supply closet door adjoining his corner office. Inside, he found a woman asleep on a folded sleeping bag, a framed photo from an old office holiday party propped beside her, and a keycard clipped to her cardigan that by every record Daniel had reviewed that week shouldn't have still worked. Daniel, 45, had been recruited by Halbrook's board 6 weeks earlier to turn around a $340 million mid-size financial services firm following the previous CEO's ouster, amid 2 consecutive quarters of declining revenue and a 60-position restructuring that had rattled the company's culture badly enough to trigger the board's intervention in the first place. The woman, Diane Voss, 58, had served as executive assistant to Halbrook's previous CEO for 22 years, a tenure that ended 7 months earlier when she was among the 60 employees eliminated in the very restructuring that had ultimately cost her former boss his job as well. Diane's severance, calculated under Halbrook's outdated formula of 1 week's pay per year of service, totaled 22 weeks. Generous sounding, until Diane explained that her final salary of $58,000 annually made that severance stretch barely 5 months once her mortgage, once mortgage, medical costs, and basic living expenses were accounted for. Diane's employer-sponsored health coverage lapsed 60 days after her termination, and continuing coverage through COBRA would have cost her $640 monthly, an amount she couldn't sustain alongside dwindling severance. A gap that became catastrophic when she suffered a hip fracture requiring surgery 4 months into her unemployment, consuming nearly all of her remaining savings. Diane lost her apartment 3 months before Daniel found her, and rather than enter the county's overcrowded shelter system, where, at 58 and recovering from surgery, she worried openly about safety, she realized her badge access, overlooked during Halbrook's IT offboarding process, still granted her entry after hours. Daniel's first instinct wasn't to call security. He sat down on an overturned filing box across from Diane, introduced himself properly, and asked simply how long this had been going on, a question that visibly startled Diane, who'd clearly braced herself for a very different reaction. As Diane explained her circumstances, Daniel noticed something else. The office's neglected plants, ones his predecessor's staff had apparently stopped watering months earlier, were thriving. And a stack of long-dormant client files in the archive room had been reorganized with the same meticulous system Diane had maintained for over 2 decades. Unpaid, unnoticed work she'd kept doing out of what she called, simply, habit, and maybe not knowing how to stop caring about the place. That same week, Daniel was quietly managing a looming crisis. Halbrook's largest client relationship, worth $40 million in annual managed assets, was at risk of termination over a contractual dispute involving a fee structure amendment nobody on the current staff could locate documentation for. Diane recalled, almost immediately upon hearing the client's name, a 2014 side letter renegotiating that exact fee structure, filed not in the digital record system implemented years later, but in a physical archive box she could locate within minutes. A document that resolved the dispute entirely in Halbrook's favor. The resolved crisis wasn't just a lucky break. It demonstrated starkly that Halbrook had eliminated 22 years of irreplaceable institutional knowledge through a severance formula that treated tenure as a cost to minimize rather than a value to retain, a pattern Daniel suspected correctly extended well beyond Diane's individual case. Daniel requested a full review of the prior restructuring's outcomes, uncovering that 34 of the 60 employees eliminated had held tenures exceeding 15 years, with exit interview data showing a consistent pattern. The company's severance and transition support had been structured around minimizing short-term costs without accounting for either institutional knowledge loss or the disproportionate hardship faced by longer tenured, often older employees re-entering the job market. Daniel presented Diane's case, de-identified initially, then, with her permission, specifically to Halbrook's board 3 weeks later, proposing a revised severance and transition framework. Extended severance scaled for tenure beyond 10 years, a 12-month employer-subsidized health coverage bridge, Idir Intrahuazen, and mandatory career transition support for any future restructuring. Two board members raised cost concerns, estimating the revised framework would add roughly $1.8 million annually in contingent liability across future restructurings. Daniel countered with data showing Halbrook's prior restructuring had already cost an estimated $2.3 million in lost institutional knowledge, client relationship disruption, and rehiring expenses, making the proposed framework, by his own accounting, considerably cheaper than the status quo it replaced. Daniel didn't simply rehire Diane into her former assistant role. He created a new position, Director of Institutional Client Relations, at a salary of $92,000 annually, explicitly built around the exact kind of long-term relationship and historical knowledge her prior role had never been formally compensated for holding. Diane's trembling voice carried both relief and a specific, hard-won caution as she asked Daniel directly whether this was gratitude or genuine belief in her value, telling him plainly she'd rather decline than accept a role built on pity she'd have to quietly earn her way out from under. With stable income restored, Diane secured a modest apartment within 6 weeks, working with a caseworker Daniel connected her to through the company's newly expanded employee assistance program. Support Daniel insisted be available to any employee navigating housing instability going forward, not just the one whose situation he'd personally discovered. A workforce researcher Daniel consulted while designing the new policy cited a specific, under-discussed pattern. Displaced professional workers over 55, particularly women, represent a disproportionate share of what researchers term hidden homelessness, neuroset individuals cycling through cars, informal arrangements, or, in Diane's case, workplace access loopholes, rather than appearing in conventional shelter statistics at all. Daniel later told Diane privately that his own father had been laid off from a manufacturing role at 56, spending 14 months underemployed before finding stable work again, a family history Daniel said made him considerably less willing than some executives to treat tenure and age as liabilities rather than assets during his tenure as CEO. 12 months into Daniel's leadership, Halbrook's revised transition framework had been used in one smaller subsequent restructuring, with post-departure employee surveys showing markedly improved outcomes and, notably, 0 reported instances of the kind of housing crisis Diane had quietly survived without anyone at the company initially knowing. Daniel didn't discover a security breach that first week. He discovered exactly how completely a company can fail someone who gave it 22 years, without a single policy technically being broken along the way. The lesson isn't that every hidden crisis resolves as neatly as Diane's did, with a convenient client emergency proving her worth just in time. It's that institutional value and human dignity rarely show up on a balance sheet until someone is willing to actually open the closet door instead of calling security first. And that the cost of not looking is almost always higher than anyone accounts for until it's sitting right in front of them.